Welcome, I'm Allison Baruti Sarbararia, and today I'll be talking about a relatively new area of child development, the brain, and brain development in young children, prenatally and during the first 5 years of life. A lot goes on in brain development during this time span, and we're just starting to understand it and how it relates to children's development, growth, and learning. The brain is one of the largest and most complex organs in the human body. It begins developing 3 weeks after conception, and at birth it weighs less than a pound, yet it's one of our most complex and fascinating organs. The brain is made up of more than 100 billion nerve cells, or neurons, and these are the building blocks of the brain. And the brain is a physical structure. Sometimes we talk about the brain and the mind interchangeably, but the brain is the physical structure, and the mind is the consciousness or the manifestation of thoughts, emotions, perceptions, memories, and imagination. And it's unclear exactly how that's connected with the brain, whether the brain produces it, whether this resides in the brain, whether the mind's something that's intangible. And we're not going to really get into that philosophical debate. We're going to talk more about the brain structure itself and how the brain develops and how that relates to what we know about child development and how we can help children develop to be healthy and productive members of society. So now I'm going to talk about the structure of the brain. And one thing to note about the brain is the brain is constantly changing. New neural pathways are forming all the time. And when we're young, this happens very quickly and easily. It's called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity decreases as we get older. It's still possible for the brain to change, but it just happens at a slower pace. So the first part of the brain to develop is the brainstem right here. And the reason this is the first part of the brain to develop is the brainstem regulates essential functions like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. So without the brainstem, we can't live. And this all happens unconsciously. We don't tell our heart to beat, we don't tell ourselves to breathe, we don't tell our blood pressure to regulate. It just happens on its own. So it's all responsible by the brainstem. Next to the brainstem is the cerebellum. Cerebellum is Latin for little brain, and it controls the voluntary movement, balance, and coordination. So it develops next. Underneath our ears, or behind our ears, is the temporal lobe, right here in the yellow. And it's primarily responsible for auditory perception and hearing. It also plays a role in emotion and language development, which is connected to hearing. Language is very much connected to what we hear oftentimes, and language and emotion are highly connected with each other. So this is this part of the brain. Next to the temporal lobe is the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is responsible for vision. And while it's well developed at birth, it needs a lot of input from the environment for it to form those neural pathways so we have what we call vision, so we can actually see. It's called experience expectant. The structure is formed, but it needs a lot of experience to form vision, or for vision to develop. Up here in the teal is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is information processing about temperature, taste, touch, and movement. So there's other senses right here, are all controlled by the parietal lobe. And finally, we get to the front of the brain right here, which is appropriately named the frontal lobe. It's the largest lobe and does a bit of everything. But mainly it's responsible for motor function, problem solving, memory, judgment, and social behavior. And there's a little part right here, right behind our forehead, that's called the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain, in the frontal lobe that's responsible for planning and complex cognition and regulation, so things like executive functioning. And it's the last part of our brain to develop. So if you wonder why your young children or teenagers might be impulsive or do things that seem completely irrational to you, it's because this part of their brain hasn't developed yet. Now, if we look at the brain from the top, we would notice that there's two hemispheres, one hemisphere and another hemisphere, the right and left hemispheres. And between them is this chasm. Connecting these two hemispheres is the corpus callosum. And that's basically just a large band of neurofibers connecting the two brain hemispheres. And it carries messages in between the two brain hemispheres. As I was talking about it on the last slide, the brain develops from the bottom here and goes around to the front as it develops. So again, the brain stem is the first part of the brain to develop, which makes sense because it's essential for life. And then the last part of the brain to develop is this prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for things like executive functioning and reasoning. If we were to slice the brain open, we would see a number of structures here in the middle part of the brain, such as the limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus. And those all have to do with memory and emotion regulation. So again, early on in life, around 2 to 3 months of age, children can start remembering what happened a few days ago or a few weeks ago. And by 6 months, the hippocampus is well developed. Also, the amygdala, which is responsible for emotion regulation, is well developed. However, what's important to note is that although these areas for emotion and memory are developed, emotion regulation in and of itself is poorly developed at birth and for the first few years of life. And it takes a lifetime to learn emotion regulation. So it develops very slowly in children, and even into adulthood can develop very slowly. But the parts of the brain that control it are well developed. The brain is made up of neurons or nerve cells, and these are the building blocks of the brain. And again, remember that there are over 100 billion neurons in the brain. Around 24 weeks of gestation, the fetus or unborn baby has all its neurons that it will ever have in its life. So let's go over what a neuron looks like. So this whole cell is a neuron. This part here is the cell body. Here's the nucleus. Here are the dendrites. And then down here is the axon, which connects to the synapses. And when this nerve cell sends a message, it goes down the axon to the synapses, over the synaptic gap to another neuron or nerve cell. And then these cells are wired or connected with each other, and a neuron can connect with one or many other neurons. This teal color or blue color over the axon is the myelin sheath, and it's just fatty tissue that forms over the axon and helps speed up the rate at which the messages are sent along the axon. And this forms a lot during the last few weeks of gestation. The baby puts on more fat on its body, and fat wraps around the axon and speeds up these neural connections. Wiring begins in utero and continues throughout our lives. Wiring happens very rapidly in babies and young children and then slows down as we get older. At first, wiring follows a genetic blueprint where genes give directions as to how neurons should connect. Next, these connections become more precise, with those connections that are used getting stronger and faster, and those connections that are not used are pruned or lost. Children have twice as many neural connections as adults. It is experience that shapes the brain and determines which connections stay and strengthen, and which ones weaken and disappear. One example is language. and language development. At birth, babies can distinguish all phonetic or unique sounds in a language for every language. But over the first year of life, only those connections that are used, or the sounds that the baby hears, are strengthened, and those that are not used, or the sounds that babies don't hear, don't differentiate, are pruned or lost. And this is a video on YouTube that it goes more into detail about wiring and neural pathways and connections. So if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend this video. So what can parents and caregivers do to help foster positive development of the brain? Well, one thing is good nutrition. Again, during the first 2 years of life, development of the brain is very rapid. And children need good nutrition. They need to have a high caloric intake in order for these wires in their brain, or for these neurons in the myelin sheath to form and cover the axon with fat, so these pathways become faster and faster. So good nutrition is really key. The next thing is experience. Experience. I can't say it enough, but what shapes neural pathways in the brain and how neurons connect is experience. It's what makes these neural pathways precise and strengthens them and makes them faster. So it's what babies are exposed to and what young children are exposed to really impacts their neural development. Maximizing warm, positive interactions and relationships. Before 18 months, all memory is implicit. So we have feelings associated with it, but we don't have specific autobiographical memories at this point. But it really shapes how we view the world, whether we trust what's going on in the world, whether we trust others, the relationships we have with ourselves, with others around us, are all formed in the first few years of life. And they continue to develop throughout life, but they're really shaped by these early experiences, these early implicit experiences. So having warm, positive interactions is really helpful. When children are exposed to a lot of negative interactions, either with themselves and their parent, or between parents, or between adults in their environment, this is called toxic stress if it happens over a long period of time, and it really builds up and it really slows down these neural pathways in the brain and really interferes with cognition and development. Something else that parents and caregivers can do is they can help children to remember. So after 18 months, children start having explicit memories. And one thing parents can do to help shape children's self-awareness, their identity, what they remember and how they process emotions, is by asking children questions that help them remember their experience and process that experience. So, for instance, 3 things you can ask your child at the end of the day is, what was something that you liked today? What was something good that happened today? So process some positive experiences. Have a child recall that, and that strengthens those neural pathways. You can also ask the child what's something kind that they did or something nice that they did for someone that day. Again, this helps reinforce those neural pathways and helps the child identify themselves as a good or caring or kind person. And finally, we all have challenges in our life, in our day-to-day life. So asking children what was something challenging helps them process the emotions around that. And you can help talk through that with your child. So if they had a difficult time separating, going to preschool that day, they wanted to stay with you and they were fussy and crying. Maybe that was something that was really hard for them. Talking about that and helping them process those emotions, again, helps them become more emotionally aware and helps them to be more emotionally regulated. If brain development is a topic that you're really interested in, here are 3 really great resources. The first one's The Whole Brain Child by Daniel Siegel. And you can get it in paperback, you can get it as an audiobook, but it really talks about brain development, how that impacts child development, and strategies parents can use to help children develop healthy, in positive, healthy ways. Another resource is 3 Core Concepts in Early Development. And this is done through Harvard. And they have 3 videos that talk about these really basic concepts in child development related to things like neural development, toxic stress, and how this impacts child development. And what are things that parents and caretakers can do to help children develop. And then also there's something called In Brief, The Science of Early Childhood Development. And again, this is a resource through Harvard, and it just explains in layman's terms about brain development in young children, prenatally and in the first few years of life. So if you're interested in this topic, these are 3 great resources to check out. As always, if you have questions or want to get more information about these topics, you can email me at positiveparentingperspectives@gmail.com. You can also visit the website at www.positiveparentingperspectives.com and look at more videos and resources that I have there. So thank you for joining me today.